Did he rule in this way while he was here on earth? No. No. Completely differently. But when will Jesus rule in this way? When he comes back. And whether we think of that, I'm not getting into eschatology here with pre, post, millennial, that's whatever you happen to think about that, right? Whether he is living, doing that here on earth. The point is that when Jesus returns, everyone will acknowledge him. The whole world will acknowledge his rule. That everyone will pay him the homage that he is due. Every eye will see him and every knee will bow. And that he will do all of these things. He will bring justice for the oppressed, for the needy, for the downtrodden, and the world will be remade. That everything will be renewed. That however you conceive of that, that is the result of Jesus' second coming. The second coming of Christ will realize these things as Messiah. Right? That he will be the idealized ruler and king that is envisioned here. All right. Why then begin the psalm with verses about judgment? Asking to endow the king with justice, and in verse 2, judge the people. Why judgment? Is that something we really want to ask for? If it's in our favor, sure, yeah. Reminds me of the Calvin and Hobbes strip where he's reminded by his mother that life is not fair. And he says, well, I know that. I just want it to be unfair in my favor more of the time. But why ask for judgment? Justice, yeah. Yeah, the idea is that we want that kind of justice. The people who have been downtrodden, the people that feel oppressed, the people who have had unfair things done to them do want judgment with the expectation that we will receive judgment in our favor. Right? The people who have been oppressed, the righteous who have suffered at the hands of the unrighteous, do not fear judgment. It was it Lewis or Chesterton? I think it might have been C.S. Lewis that talks about this, that the difference between children and adults and the fiction that they like is seen in the way they want the stories to end. That children want the evil punished and the good rewarded. They want justice to be done because they are innocent. Children do not have that same conception that the adults have of knowing my own guiltiness. That as adults, we know how bad we are, and we like stories that end with mercy and forgiveness. Those who are oppressed and downtrodden, those that are suffering, want God to come with judgment. What does it mean then for him to be righteous, this king? The royal son with your righteousness, he will judge your people with righteousness, your afflicted ones with justice. Well, to be above reproach, yeah. The idea that he will borrow of God for this, right? That he will have the righteousness and the justice of God is an important idea that we become righteous and just when we align our thoughts, our actions, our will with what God wants. That as we bring ourselves more closely into an understanding of who God is and what God would do and become like that, we ourselves become more righteous and just. That for the king, then, to have God's righteousness and God's justice, or to be given that, is to do as God would have him do, is to do as God wills. I had a question here about the poor. We already kind of talked about why they are interested in this. What about the mountains and the hills? Verse 3. Mountains bring prosperity, the hills the fruit of righteousness. What have they got to do with these two things? Why mountains and hills? Sure, yeah. The places that were considered holy were usually higher places, right? Even in the pagan religions, right, when they talk about getting rid of the pagan worship, they talk about the high places. They talk about Mount Zion. The temple is put up on top of the hill. As you pointed out, Moses, when he speaks to God, goes up on the mountain as well. There's certainly an element of that approach to God or holiness in that. Yeah. The mountains and the hills, too, are standing in here for the idea of the nation as a whole, too, right? That this is going to encompass the people in their entirety. Right? The land itself will be part of this, and so the nation, right? We say the land of Israel. Well, we don't necessarily mean just the physical dirt. We say the land of Israel, we mean the people that live there and everything that is a part of it. Yeah. 4 returns again to the idea of the oppressed and the poor. This is a common theme that starts in this particular psalm, and it will return to it in the middle and near the end, though. Looking at that clock, I don't know if I will get there. The justice for the poor is tied directly to the idea of defeat for people who will oppress them. We see in 4 that it is, the NIV has him crushing the oppressor. Other translations may use that slightly differently, but defeat, break apart. The idea is of utter destruction that comes in the word there. It's an important thing to tie that to, because you do not truly have justice for those that have been oppressed until those that would oppress them are defeated. It is the idea not merely of rescue for the poor or of recompense, trying to give them something to compensate for what has been done, but for the actual defeat of those who are opposing them. Right? The final victory. And this is another element of it that makes it reminiscent of messianic kind of prophecy. Because when Jesus comes, right, it is not merely about receiving benefits. Those of us that have been his followers will be given good things. There is another side to that coin, too. Right? Remembers the parable of the sheep and the goats. There is justice not only in the giving of what is good and deserved to those that are righteous, but of the punishment for the wicked. Right? These two things go hand in hand. Verse 5 is an interesting verse. This is translated a few different ways. Here in the NIV, and I believe in the ASV that I was looking at, he will endure as long as the sun. The word endure does not actually appear in the Hebrew. It simply says that he will be with the sun, and the same for the moon. What is being said here with the sun and the moon? What is the idea that is being conveyed? There's a forever idea here, right? Which is what the translators are doing by inserting kind of that word to help us be clear. I think there's another way to understand this as well, potentially. What else could this mean by talking about with the sun and with the moon? It's similar, but a little bit different.
They are always with us. We see them all the time.
Continuity, yes, that it is constant. During the day, during the night, there is no getting away from it, which is a parallel or kind of related idea to the idea of forever, right? That it will continue to endure. But along with that, there is not a time of the day in which this is not available. God does not sleep.
It says also through all generations.
Yes, yeah, it certainly drives that home. And I think that the reason that we often have that endure is because the end of it talking about all generations. But I like the idea as well of the continuity or the constant presence of God. It endures forever, but he is also constantly present. There is no getting away. There is no escaping from him. And this is an idea you find in other Psalms as well, right? That no matter where you go, anywhere that you are, God is both present with you and is able to do things, whether it is for your benefit or to punish those who would try to escape him. The image of the rain in the next verse is an idea of the provision that God has for those that fear him. The righteous will flourish. That is to say, this is the other half that we were talking about, we've been talking about justice and the defeat of those who do evil. Those who are righteous will actually benefit. Um, the provision is made for the God-fearing. Yeah.
No, I'm sorry, I gotta ask. When I think of the Middle East, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan,
Mhm.
Egypt, Jerusalem, the last thing I think of is people mowing the lawn. Did they have lawnmowers?
Not lawnmowers, but the idea of cutting grass is still something that is done. Boy, yeah, seeing someone with a scythe. If you've ever seen somebody work with a scythe, they can be as fast or faster than an actual lawnmower. And the idea of there being grass to mow, they didn't have a lawn in the way that we think of a lawn. Sure, right? You don't have a house with a white picket fence and a lawn in front. But you would have a field potentially. And those sorts of ideas of grass or wild grasses growing that need to be cut down, whether for forage for animals or things like that, is something that is common to any sort of agricultural society. Yeah, or weeds even potentially, but yeah, you could cultivate a field with food, essentially plants for your animals to consume. And then as well, this is something that I was not going to talk about since it's getting into the weeds. We're getting into the weeds with it a little bit, is that the hilltops are mentioned a few times. These are actually the most probably fertile places in that area of the world. The best soil, the best farms and so forth tend to involve being on hills. For whatever reason, I'm not a botanist, but yeah.
Going to the other verse, like mountains and version, or the mountains and hills.
Mm-hmm.
Because mostly I've seen it's not in the fields, the agriculture. It's more along the mountains and hills and stuff like that. So.
Yeah. It has to do with I guess that area of the world. But again, I'm so ignorant about these matters and their details that I couldn't possibly tell you why. Yeah.
Another thing about this in verse 6,
Mm-hmm.
rain is falling,
Mm-hmm.
is we're talking about the just and the unjust as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the New Testament, we talk a lot about God lets the rains fall on the just and the unjust likewise because he gives good to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this verse is bringing that up again, that even though the psalmist is asking for judgment and stuff, the judgment of God is really just. It's built in justice. And so you'll see the rains falling on the good and bad. And I think that's something he's trying to show here too.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly the case that the world, and that is an excellent reference to the Gospels. The rain falling on the just and the unjust is something that occurs. I think that this is because of its sense of the eschatological, the end times, and the messianic nature of it is actually looking forward to a time when that is not going to occur. That as it follows in the verse, in 7, that this idea of the rain falling as a blessing from God will cease to be a thing that is for the benefit of anyone who is not righteous. I admit that that's a little bit more of an implication that I'm reading into what it says here than an explicit statement. But the idea throughout the entire psalm is of benefit for those who follow God, the people of God, those who are righteous, and of punishment, judgment, and destruction for those who are his enemies. And that this kind of dichotomy will begin to exist in the world with the coming of the one final, true king, that is to say, the Messiah. And there is an element of this desire for it to happen in that this psalm being used potentially for earthly kings, right? If it is on the occasion of Solomon's ascension, this is the desire of reaching an idealized state that they know they will not achieve. Solomon is not the Messiah, but that it is aspirational is the wrong word because you don't really aspire to become that yourself, but of a forward looking to the distant future. Yeah. Need to keep moving here. I said that one already. Verse 8. What is verse 8 tell us about the king and his kingdom. Perhaps we need to know what they mean when they say the river. Yeah, it's actually a reference to the Euphrates River rather than to the Jordan River, as one might assume. Anybody know where the Euphrates River is geographically relative to Israel? It runs through the middle of Iraq. Yeah, it's far off to the east. It was in what would have been Babylon. It goes through Babylon and then down to the Persian Gulf, if I'm remembering, rather than the Red Sea. This were originally the idea of what the Promised Land was going to encompass a much wider area, and through various reasons, the people's disobedience and so forth, this was never fully realized. This is another instance of an idealized kingdom being envisioned, of the true extent of what ought to be the kingdom being accomplished and being realized, that he will be the king from the traditional and boundary, the idealized boundary of the Promised Land. But then where does it go after that? What's the other end?
The whole world.
The ends of the earth. It's the whole world, right? Which is, again, going far beyond the original conception of the earthly Promised Land. Even though it begins with this idealized idea of what the Promised Land boundary would be, it moves beyond that. Now, is that at all possible? Would they have thought this was within the realm of reality for any of the kings that they had to this point? Whether we think of this as being Solomon or any king that comes after him. Was that reasonable? No, of course not. It was bonkers, this idea. That they would have a kingdom that stretched to places they had never even heard of or seen before, off the edges of their map as they knew it. So why put that in here? Why pray that the king be given a kingdom too large for them to even really conceive of? It's again the idealized idea of what a king should be. The perfect king.
He controls the whole world and he's just. You're going to have justice through the whole world.
Yes, it is the idea again of the eschaton, of the end times, of the Messiah coming to bring redemption for the entire world, for everything to be remade as God originally intended it to be. Right? This is the end of all things. Right? If you look at the Hebrew Scriptures and you start back in the Garden of Eden and they have the fall, there is this idea of a return to what was originally intended. The world as God created it to be, with the king ruling the whole world, with the justice and righteousness of God, giving good things to the people, destroying the oppressors. And again, this idea of it being the whole world is part of that. Now, when they use this for an earthly king, it is not necessarily with the expectation that the earthly king will achieve this in the same way that their earthly king will not be perfect in his justice and perfect in his righteousness. But that is the goal towards which he should strive, is expanding the area that God's righteousness and justice prevails in. And so many of the kings fell so far short of that. But this is the goal. This is the perfect world that they are trying to envision. Yeah. 9 moves on. The desert tribes here in the NIV. Other translations may have a slightly different word here. The actual word means creatures of the desert, meaning anything at all that lives in the desert, whether human or animal. Just simply desert-dwelling things will bow down before him. The idea, again, being, I think, by broadening that category, that this is not just the king, but also the Messiah, right? The idea that all creation will acknowledge the lordship of the Messiah. Right? What does Jesus tell the people when he has his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. What happens? What will happen, he says, if the people don't cry out and acclaim him? The rocks will do it. Right? That it cannot be stopped. That acclaim is all of creation acknowledges who God is. And this is, I think, another example. And again, the hyperbole for an earthly king, but the reality for the Messiah. That all creation acknowledges the Messiah. I really like the figure of licking the dust. It's such a great metaphor for abject subjugation, right? That someone is face down and licking the dust. I can't imagine anything I would like to, well, that's not true. There are a few things that I can imagine wanting to do less. That just seems so unpleasant. So unpleasant. It's a great figure of defeat or of subjugation. There's some more geography here in verse 10. We have Tarshish. Where is Tarshish? Anyone?
Far away from Nineveh.
It's far away from Nineveh.
But isn't that Lebanon now? Up on the coastline?
Yeah, there's some disagreement about exactly where this is. This is, it's certainly on the coast, right? It's a port city. People disagree, but the point is that it generally is thought of kind of to be north and probably west of the main area of Israel and Jerusalem. The next reference, in the NIV it has distant shores, but the more literal translation here is of islands. Again, the idea is that this is going towards the sea. And the sea, when you talk about it in the biblical context, the sea was the Mediterranean Sea. So that is, if we're looking at a kind of a map that's conventionally oriented, it's up and left. Where is Sheba, which is also in this verse?
Queen of Sheba, Ethiopia, center of Africa.
People talk about Ethiopia. There's other people that would argue that it, or possibly Seba, where the Sabaeans live, is in the Arabian Peninsula down near Yemen. Which again, if we're looking at a conventionally oriented map, is down and to the right. And so as figures here, this is a repetition of what we had before of the idea from the river to the ends of the earth. It is encompassing the map. From one end of the world that we know to the other end of the world that we know. Everything. From one end of the world to the other. This is how much territory will be under the influence of the king. Everything. It's another poetic figure for everything, everywhere, everyone. All of these people will bring tribute. All of these people will acknowledge, verse 11, all the kings and all the nations will bow down and serve him. They will acknowledge who he is, what he deserves. This is a recognition of the king as the servant of God, as the representation or the emissary almost of God on earth. The king is supposed to, as the ruler of God's chosen people, dispense God's justice and do God's will. And the nations should recognize that. All right, well, I'm about halfway through, but I am fully out of time. I didn't get to some of these other things here at the end. It's probably worth noting that verse 20 may not actually be part of this psalm. It's conventionally listed as a verse here, but it just simply says this concludes the prayers of David and David, son of Jesse. This is the end of the second book of the Psalms. And as well, probably 18 and 19. They don't fit as well with the rest of it. They may have been added subsequently as part of this collection, but they are not necessarily out of place in this particular psalm. Other thoughts, other comments, questions, things I didn't get to or passed over too quickly? Anyone? All right, well, we have finished 2 of the 5 books of the Psalms. We will start book 3 with Psalm 73 next week. Thank you very much.